The story of 1 Samuel begins not with kings or warriors, but with a woman named Hannah, whose deep sorrow became the catalyst for a divine move. Hannah was barren, unable to have children, in a culture where childbearing was not just a personal blessing but a societal expectation. This made her suffering unbearable. To make matters worse, her husband Elkanah had another wife, Peninnah, who had many children and constantly mocked Hannah, using her barrenness as a weapon to humiliate her. Year after year, as the family went to the temple in Shiloh to worship and offer sacrifices, Hannah silently carried the heavy burden of public shame and private heartbreak. But Hannah's story is not simply one of sorrow, it is one of relentless faith. Instead of allowing bitterness to take root in her heart, she did what few would have the strength to do. She took her pain directly to God. One day, in the quiet of the temple, overwhelmed by grief, she poured out her soul in prayer. She didn't care that her lips moved without sound or that Eli, the high priest, mistook her for being drunk. With trembling lips, she cried out to God, vowing that if he gave her a son, she would dedicate him fully to the Lord's service. God heard. In time, Hannah conceived and gave birth to a son, naming him Samuel, meaning God has heard. Yet what makes Hannah's faith remarkable is not only that she prayed, but that she kept her vow. Once Samuel was weaned, she returned to the temple, not with resentment, but with gratitude. She released her long-awaited son into God's hands, trusting that he was part of a bigger plan. And so, out of the quiet anguish of one woman's prayer, God raised up Samuel, the prophet who would guide Israel through one of its most pivotal transitions. Hannah's story reminds us today that sometimes God's greatest works begin not in power, but in surrender. While Hannah's story is a testimony of personal faith, the nation of Israel, at large, was walking a much darker path. By the time Samuel was growing up, Israel had fallen into deep spiritual decline. The very people chosen by God to be set apart had become numb to his presence. Worship had become routine, hollow, and powerless. The priests themselves, who were supposed to lead Israel in holiness, were corrupt to the core. Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas, abused their sacred position, stealing from the offerings and defiling women who came to worship at the tabernacle. The place that was meant to be a house of reverence had become a place of greed, exploitation, and sin. Yet, what makes this decline even more tragic is that the people didn't even seem to notice. They had become so familiar with God's blessings that they no longer valued his presence. When the Philistines threatened them, instead of humbling themselves and seeking the Lord, they tried to use the Ark of the Covenant as a lucky charm, hoping it would guarantee victory in battle. But God cannot be manipulated. His power is not available to those who refuse to honor him. As a result, Israel suffered a devastating defeat. The ark was captured, Eli's sons were killed, and upon hearing the news, Eli himself fell, broke his neck, and died. This was more than just a military loss. It was a symbol of Israel's spiritual reality. The glory had departed. Even the wife of Phinehas, upon giving birth after the tragedy, named her son Ichabod, meaning the glory has left Israel. The presence of God, once their strength and identity, was now absent. In those days, the word of the Lord was rare and visions were infrequent. Heaven seemed silent. But this silence was not because God had forgotten his people. It was because they had hardened their hearts and drifted so far away that they could no longer hear him. Yet even in this dark chapter, God was quietly preparing Samuel, a boy untouched by the corruption, to become the voice that would break the silence and lead Israel back. In the middle of Israel's spiritual drought, when the nation could no longer hear God's voice, God quietly chose a child. Samuel was no warrior, no priest from a noble lineage, but a boy, the long-awaited answer to Hannah's desperate prayer. From the time he was weaned, Samuel grew up in the temple at Shiloh, surrounded by sacred things that had long since lost their meaning to the corrupt priests. He swept the floors, tended the lamps, and heard the empty rituals day after day. Yet, unlike those around him, Samuel's heart remained pure, untouched by the spiritual decay that plagued Israel. Then, one silent night, as the oil lamps flickered and the world slept, Samuel heard a voice call his name. Assuming it was Eli, the high priest who had raised him like a son, he quickly ran to him. But Eli sent him back, saying, "I did not call you." Again and again the voice came, and again Samuel ran to Eli, confused but obedient. On the third time, Eli realized with a chilling certainty that after years of silence, God was speaking again, not to him, the high priest, but to a child. Eli instructed Samuel to respond, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." Samuel obeyed, and for the first time in his life, he heard the voice of the living God. But the message was anything but comforting. God revealed to Samuel the coming judgment against Eli's house, against the very man who had loved and raised him. Imagine the weight on young Samuel's heart. A boy, tasked to deliver a devastating prophecy to the only father figure he had ever known. At dawn, Samuel stood before Eli trembling. Yet he did not hold back the truth, and Eli, humbled and resigned, accepted it. From that day on, Samuel's life was no longer ordinary. The silence was broken. God's voice returned to Israel, but not through a king or a seasoned priest, through the quiet obedience of a boy. Samuel became the prophet who would prepare the nation for its greatest and most painful transition, standing as God's voice when the people most needed to hear it. Despite God's faithfulness throughout Israel's history, the nation found itself restless, weary of being different from the nations around them. They no longer wanted to be a people ruled directly by God. They wanted what they could see, a king like everyone else had. The elders came to Samuel, now old and worn from years of faithfully leading them, and said plainly, "Give us a king to lead us." To them, it seemed logical. Other nations had kings who looked strong, who led their armies into battle, who gave them a sense of stability. But what Israel failed to see was that their strength had never come from human leaders. It had always come from the hand of God. Samuel, heartbroken, took their demand personally. He had served them since he was a boy, standing between them and God through countless victories and failures. Yet when he prayed, God told him something even more heartbreaking. "It is not you they have rejected, but me." The people were turning away from their true king, the one who had delivered them from Egypt, parted the Red Sea, and brought down the walls of Jericho. They believed their problem was the lack of a visible leader, but the real issue was their lack of faith. Still, God allowed it. He would give them what they asked for, but it would not be the blessing they hoped. Through Samuel, God warned them clearly, "A king will not only lead you, but take from you. He will take your sons for his army, your daughters for his palace, your fields, your vineyards, your wealth, and eventually even your freedom. You will cry out under the weight of your own choice." But the people refused to listen. "No, we want a king over us," they insisted. They wanted to be like other nations, blind to the fact that God himself had set them apart to be different. They traded divine leadership for human leadership, rejecting the very one who had never failed them. And so, God stepped back, not out of anger, but to let them learn. Sometimes, the hardest lessons come when God gives us exactly what we demand. Saul was everything Israel thought they wanted in a king. He was tall, strong, and impressive, a man who looked the part. To the people, Saul seemed like the answer to their prayers. When Samuel first saw him, even he was struck by Saul's appearance. Surely this was the kind of man who could lead Israel into battle, bring honor to the nation, and give them the security they craved. But appearances can be deceiving. God saw deeper. Saul's path to kingship started not with a royal ceremony, but with a simple task, searching for his father's lost donkeys. Yet behind this ordinary errand was the hidden hand of God. God had already told Samuel that he would send him the one who would be Israel's first king. When Saul finally met Samuel, he was unaware of the destiny waiting for him, but Samuel knew. He privately anointed Saul, declaring him the chosen ruler. Still, Saul struggled to believe it. "Am I not from the smallest tribe? And is my family not the least of them?" he asked. Saul saw himself as ordinary, and perhaps at first this humility seemed like a strength. But when the moment came for Saul's public calling, fear gripped him. He hid among the baggage, literally hiding from the responsibility. Yet God still brought him forward. Before all the people, Saul stood taller than anyone else, and the crowd erupted in cheers, shouting, "Long live the king!" On the surface, it seemed like a dream fulfilled. Israel finally had its king. Yet, beneath the surface, something was missing. Saul was chosen by God, but also chosen to teach Israel a painful lesson. He would be the king they asked for, but not the king they needed. His strength could not replace obedience. His image could not replace character. And though he began with promise, winning early battles and uniting the tribes, cracks had already begun to show. Saul feared man more than God. He sought control more than surrender. Israel got exactly what they demanded, but they were about to learn that without God at the center, even the strongest king would crumble. While Saul looked like a king, David was the last person anyone would expect to wear a crown. He wasn't tall, battle-tested, or from a noble household. He was the youngest son of Jesse, a simple shepherd boy tending sheep in the quiet hills of Bethlehem. Even his own family overlooked him. When God sent Samuel to Jesse's house to anoint the next king, no one even bothered to invite David to the gathering. He was left in the fields, unnoticed and forgotten. But God sees differently than people do. While others look at outward appearance, God looks at the heart. One by one, Jesse's older sons passed before Samuel. They were strong, experienced, and seemed fit to be king. Yet God rejected them all. Finally, when Samuel asked if there were any sons left, Jesse reluctantly mentioned David. "There is still the youngest," he said, "but he is out tending the sheep." To everyone's surprise, Samuel declared, "Send for him. We will not sit down until he arrives." When David entered, smelling of sheep and dirt, God spoke clearly to Samuel, "This is the one." Samuel anointed him on the spot, and from that day forward, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. Yet even after this incredible moment, David didn't rush to seize power. He returned to his sheep, carrying the secret of his calling in his heart. Unlike Saul, David did not seek the throne by force or ambition. He simply waited on God's timing. David's story reminds us that God often chooses the unexpected, not the tallest, the strongest, or the most admired, but the one who has a heart fully surrendered to him. David had been faithful in the small things, protecting his sheep from lions and bears, singing songs of worship in the wilderness when no one was watching. It was in the hidden places, not the spotlight, that God was shaping Israel's future king. Little did David know, soon he would be called out of the fields and onto a battlefield, where the courage he had learned in secret would change the course of Israel's history forever. David's victory over Goliath should have secured him a place of honor in Saul's kingdom. After all, he did what no one else dared, defeating the Philistine giant with nothing but a sling and a stone. Israel rejoiced, and Saul initially welcomed David into his court, even making him a commander in the army. David served Saul with loyalty and brought victory after victory, gaining the love of the people. Yet instead of celebrating David, Saul became consumed by jealousy. It began with a simple song sung by the women of Israel. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. What was meant as praise for both men pierced Saul's heart like a spear. From that day on, Saul viewed David not as a faithful servant, but as a threat. Fear gripped the king. He saw in David what he had already lost: God's favor. Saul's insecurity quickly turned to obsession. He tried to kill David openly, hurling a spear at him during one of David's moments of worship in the palace. David escaped, but Saul would not let him go. He hunted him relentlessly, using soldiers, spies, and even his own family to capture David. But David, though innocent, became a fugitive. What is remarkable is how David responded. He refused to lift a hand against Saul, even when he had every opportunity. Twice, David stood inches away from the king's life, once in a cave and once in Saul's own camp, but each time he spared him. David would not take what God had not yet given. "I will not touch the Lord's anointed," he declared. His trust was not in seizing power, but in God's perfect timing. Meanwhile, Saul's heart spiraled deeper into fear, paranoia, and violence. The king, who once stood head and shoulders above the people, was now reduced to chasing shadows. Consumed by jealousy, David, the hunted, remained steadfast. His faith, patience, and humility during this dark season set him apart, not just as a warrior, but as the kind of leader Israel truly needed, one who trusted God more than himself. Saul's story is one of the most tragic in the Bible, not because he lacked talent or opportunity, but because he refused to surrender. Though chosen and anointed by God, Saul's heart drifted. Time after time, he chose fear, pride, and self-preservation over obedience. His downfall wasn't sudden. It was the slow unraveling of a man who could not let go of control. When God gave him clear commands, Saul twisted them. When God's silence was meant to lead him to repentance, Saul sought answers elsewhere, even turning to a forbidden medium to summon the spirit of Samuel. By the time the Philistines gathered against Israel for one final battle, Saul was a shadow of the leader he once was. The man who had once stood tall in the eyes of Israel now trembled with fear. God was silent. The prophet Samuel was gone. And Saul knew deep down that the kingdom had already been torn from him and given to another, to David. Desperate and abandoned, Saul rode into battle, not with confidence, but with dread. As the battle raged on Mount Gilboa, Saul's army crumbled. His sons, including Jonathan, the noble prince who had remained faithful to both his father and to David, were struck down. Saul, wounded by arrows and surrounded by enemies, realized the inevitable. Rather than be captured and humiliated by the Philistines, he fell on his own sword. The king who once held God's favor died alone on the battlefield, not because of Israel's enemies, but because of his own refusal to fully trust God. The Philistines rejoiced, hanging Saul's body on their city walls in disgrace. Yet even in death, God showed mercy. Brave men from Jabesh Gilead, remembering Saul's early courage, risked everything to retrieve his body and give him a proper burial. Saul's life leaves us with a sobering truth. Disobedience, unchecked pride, and the fear of losing control can destroy even the most gifted. His story is a warning, but also a reminder. God does not delight in sacrifices or appearances. He delights in humble hearts willing to surrender fully to Him. After years of exile, betrayal, and constant danger, David's path to the throne finally opened, but not through rebellion or force. David never seized power. He simply received what God had promised in His perfect timing. When Saul died on the battlefield, many might have expected David to celebrate. After all, Saul had hunted him like a criminal. Yet David's first response was not triumph, but heartbreak. He tore his clothes, wept, and mourned for both Saul and Jonathan, the dear friend who had stood beside him against all odds. David understood that kingship was not something to grab, but something to be entrusted by God. Even after Saul's death, David did not rush to claim the throne. He waited, allowing God to direct each step. First, the tribe of Judah anointed him king, but the rest of Israel hesitated. For 7 more years, David remained king over only part of the nation, as internal conflict and uncertainty gripped Israel. Yet, through it all, David remained patient, refusing to manipulate, conquer, or scheme his way to power. Eventually, after years of waiting and testing, all the tribes came to David, recognizing that he was the one God had chosen all along. They declared him king over all Israel. This moment marked more than just a political unification. It was a spiritual turning point. Israel was finally ready to embrace not just any king, but the king God had prepared. David's rise teaches us that God is faithful to fulfill His promises, but He does so in His time, not ours. David did not shortcut the process, even when he could have. He trusted God even when it hurt, even when it meant wandering in caves, fleeing from armies, and suffering betrayal. Unlike Saul, who clung to the throne in fear, David took the throne in humility. He knew it was never about him. It was about God's will. And because of that, David would become the greatest king in Israel's history, not because of his strength, but because he knew who his strength came from. His story reminds us today, the best victories are the ones we receive, not the ones we take. The story of 1 Samuel is not just ancient history. It's a mirror reflecting the struggles, fears, and desires that still live in every human heart today. Israel wanted a king because they thought it would solve their problems. They were tired of waiting on God, tired of feeling different, and wanted to be like everyone else. Don't we often feel the same? How many times do we demand things from God? Relationships, success, control, convinced that if we just had that one thing, life would finally work out. Yet, like Israel, we often end up discovering that what we wanted wasn't what we truly needed. Saul's story shows us how dangerous it is when fear and pride take the place of faith. He had all the external signs of a great leader, but his heart was insecure. He feared losing control more than he feared disobeying God. That fear drove him to destruction. How often do we find ourselves doing the same? When life gets hard or uncertain, it's tempting to take matters into our own hands, to rush ahead, make compromises, or cling to control, just to feel safe. But David's story teaches us a better way. He was anointed long before he was crowned. He suffered, was rejected, and waited for years before receiving the very thing God had promised. Yet he never forced it. He trusted God, even when nothing made sense. He refused to shortcut the process. And when the crown finally came, it was not stolen, but given. This is the heart of 1 Samuel's message. God's way is harder, slower, and often confusing, but it is always better. The story reminds us that success is not about forcing results, but about surrender. Faith is proven not when things are easy, but when we trust God's timing even in the wilderness. In today's world, where we are pressured to chase quick wins, instant gratification, and self-made success, David's example calls us back to something greater. The real victory is not in getting what we want fast. It's in becoming the person God is shaping us to be, so that when His promises come, we are ready to receive them well.